Hey everyone. For this book that we read, it was The Tetris Effect by Dan Ackerman. This is a really good book, and if you don't want to listen to me drone on about it, there is a comic historian video which goes into this way, way better than I could ever hope to do. So this is about the story of Tetris, sort of how it got started, how Alexei Pajitnov programmed it, and how it made its way to the United States. This is a frickin' mess to go through. So, the way the book starts out, it's divided into three sections. You have the first section is kind of how Pajitnov and Rogers got their start in the video game industry. Alexei Pajitnov was the Russian who developed Tetris, and Rogers was an American, so he came to the United States. I can't remember exactly where from at this point, because I kind of glossed over that part. But he's an American programmer who ended up in Japan and programmed the RPG, the Black Onyx, and then eventually started his own publishing company called Bulletproof Software. And he was pretty instrumental in getting the handheld rights and also the home console rights for Nintendo for Tetris. So it's a really crazy story. There are a few players involved, but we're gonna take this chapter by chapter and kind of get through it. I'm gonna gloss over some stuff. So if you want the full story, definitely check out the Comic Historian or purchase the book here, because it is a really amazing story, just the fact how this game got all the way over here. So, we start out the book with Hank Rogers already in, or at least just arriving in Moscow to try to negotiate for the handheld rights. And just kind of his misadventures of trying to figure out where the company he needs to, well, not the government organization he needs to go to. The organization he needs to go to is L-Org. It's it's a contraction of I can't remember the exact name of it all, but I'm just going to refer to it as L-Org at this time. So he does all that, makes his way there, and we get a chapter about Alexei Pajitnov and kind of how they would call him in to be sort of like the face of Tetris, even though he didn't really own any of the rights and really wasn't entitled to anything because he programmed it for at a government installation, which is absolutely crazy. Just once you get down to it, but that was the Soviet Union at the time. He didn't really have a choice. And from there we get the backstories for Rogers and Pajitnov. And they're really interesting to kind of see how the two are similar but also different in the same way. Pajitnov had a very rigid and structured upbringing, mostly because he was in the Soviet Union, but he did have a few chances to get exposure to the Western world. So his mother would take him to films, so she would take him to the movies to see movies. She was a movie critic, which is kind of crazy to think about in the Soviet Union, but, you know, they did make him in there. It was like very rigid as to what movies they got. I don't really know all about that, but it's pretty weird when you go into censorship and everything else like that. If I get into a book about that, I can go a little bit more in depth. But right now we're just talking Tetris, and I will try not to ramble on about other things. Rogers had a little bit more of a sort of like free upbringing, mostly because he was in the United States. He had a little bit more freedom to kind of do whatever he wanted, essentially. He still was in like a fairly structured environment, but the structure was one that he created for himself, not one that was kind of like imposed upon him. Both of them were kind of drawn towards computers, but for not really for very different reasons, but in different ways. Rogers kind of got his start with computers when he went to high school, and just during the 60s, this is amazing, his high school actually had a computer, but it was one of those like huge room-size things, so it was pretty crazy. It's kind of a foreign concept to think about now. Like, of course there was a computer at his school, but back in the 60s, that really didn't happen. And this was one of the old ones that you needed punch cards, and you could really just like feed the punch cards into the computer would come back with mostly like a math calculation or something along those lines. That was probably what it did. It kind of sounds like what they were doing, but don't quote me on that. Paganoff was a little bit different. He was really into math and also into puzzle games and everything like that. So he would play one particular called Tetraminos. Basically it's Tetris, but you have to like fit the different shapes into like basically a square. And you have a few more shapes that aren't really in it. You can actually kind of see some of those shapes in the later versions of Tetris, but that's not really. That's kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. So they both get drawn to computers in different ways. Paganoff, it's kind of interesting. He gives up like an opportunity to work in the space program in Russia, which is a pretty big deal at this time. You got like a lot of prestige if you worked in the space program. They treated you pretty well as long as you actually did your job and were successful at it. And Rogers ended up going to college and took a really unique approach to it. He just did the classes that he wanted. He only wanted to do computer programming, so he didn't do any of like the required courses. And in fact, he quit college when they said, "Hey, you almost have your degree, but you need to do a year of these required classes." He said, "No, I don't," and he left and went to Japan to work in his family's gem business. So his family had moved around a lot. I should give you a little story. They started out in New York. They moved their gem business to Japan to be closer to the source. And Rogers, at that time, said, "You know what, I'm going to stay in Hawaii and surf and study computers." And that's kind of how he got to where he was. After he left Hawaii, he went to Japan, worked in his family's gem business. Paganoff, on the other hand, went to work at the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he worked on like a lot of really outdated computers, so like I can't even really explain it because I haven't even seen something this old. I mean, it's kind of crazy. He used what was called an Electronica 60, which was a knockoff, was a Soviet knockoff of another computer that was already, I think, like 5 or 6 years old at the time. So really outdated software, really outdated hardware. But he was able to kind of make it work. Sorry that I skipped a little bit there, but pretty much that's sort of the way the book goes. Rogers goes to work at the gem business, and then we jump back to Paganoff. You get a lot of these chapters that just sort of like Rogers, Paganoff, Rogers, Paganoff. It can be a little annoying, but it's a nice way to kind of explain it, because they do lay out some of the parallels between the two. So Paganoff programs Tetris there with the help of a few other people, especially Vadim Gerasimov. He helps Paganoff. Sorry, I'm getting all these names messed up a little bit here. He helps Paganoff basically port Tetris to like an IBM, which was it was the business computer, and it was also really expensive, but people actually used them as opposed to the Electronica, which was crazily outdated. From there, they get it onto like an IBM, and it sort of like gets spread around almost by like word of mouth, or literally by Paganoff or Paganoff's boss just giving people a floppy drive of it. They really weren't trying to sell it. In contrast, you get Rogers, who left his family's gem business because he was really unhappy. He was basically doing a lot of the grunt work, and he goes and starts doing like freelance programming work because he is still a computer programmer, just doesn't have a degree in it or anything like that. From there, he kind of gets a little disillusioned and decides, you know what, screw it, I'm going to program my own game. He sort of like goes to the Akihabara district and decides, you know what, people are using computers to play games, I'm going to make a game. And because Rogers was really big into D&D back in his college days, Dungeons and Dragons, he decides to program an RPG. and he names it the Black Onyx after kind of his experience with the gem business. He programs this game, and initially it doesn't sell that well, but eventually it like picks up. And he programmed this entire game by himself, which is really amazing when you look at it. I mean, thinking about RPGs now, you go, oh my god, that's impossible. But when you look at RPGs back in the 80s, you can go, okay, somebody could conceivably program this by themselves. And at the time that he did the Black Onyx, RPGs really weren't they really weren't a big thing. So you didn't have Dragon Quest, you didn't have Final Fantasy at the time. And in fact, the Black Onyx kind of inspired those games to some extent. There's a few more elements in those than there were in the Black Onyx, but you can definitely see, and I believe there are also some interviews where they're like, yeah, the Black Onyx was actually an inspiration for us. And that was a really big success for him. So you kind of have these two parallels where Pajitnov is just kind of giving his game away just so people play it and enjoy it, and Rogers was using his game as sort of a way to get away from the gem business and also to become really successful. And in the process, Rogers does make a sequel to the Black Onyx, and kind of from that experience, he's like, you know what, I think I'm just going to do publishing because this whole programming thing's it's not really working out as well, and other companies have kind of picked onto the RPG trend, so he's like, I'm just going to do publishing. And that sort of wraps up the first part of it, and then we go into the second part, which is all about Robert Stein trying to get the rights to Tetris. No, what Stein would do, he was a publisher in his own right for a company called Andromeda Software. He owned it. And he would get kind of cheap, almost knockoff programs of more successful programs from the West, but he would get them from smaller third world countries where he could kind of screw them over on the licensing deals. He wouldn't pay them a lot, and then he would license those programs out to larger companies, and he would make a lot of money off of this. He is fairly successful at doing this, and he ends up going to Hungary, which was the sort of the bridge. They call it the bridge from the Soviet Union to the West. I think it's more like a window, essentially. You can look in, people can pass you things from the window, but you're not seeing the real Eastern Bloc, that sort of thing. And you get a lot of that in the book, but some of it's not really needed for the story, but you get a lot of it where it's okay, the Soviet Union definitely is not, it says it's a superpower, and there's just sort of this veneer, basically a veneer over everything, where it's it looks like it's really good and modern, but as soon as you peel back that first layer, you realize, oh, this is a giant sham. But that's kind of where we find Stein. He's in Hungary trying to get computer programs to bring over to the West. And Pajitnov's boss had sent a copy of Tetris to it's kind of like his counterparts in Hungary. And from there, they're playing the game at their technology expo. Stein sees it, goes, okay, this could be something. I think this could be something. And he decides. It's very weird at this point. He takes the game, he tries to get the rights, but at the same time, he's trying to get the rights from Pajitnov and what would eventually become Elorg after the Soviet state steps in and decides to muddle everything up. Instead of actually securing the rights outright, he starts selling them off, and he sells them initially to Mirrorsoft. He just had what he thought he had was the home console and the computer rights because of the way he had worded the initial contract. He really didn't have any rights at this point, so it was kind of crazy the way he did it. And also Mirrorsoft was well, you know what, we'll start selling the thing, and then we'll worry about backdating the paperwork later. It'll be fine. And so Mirrorsoft and their U.S. subsidiary, Spectrum Holobyte, they start sub-licensing the game off, so they sub-license the home console ports to a company called, well, basically it's Atari Games, but they have to publish games under the Tengen logo because they didn't have the rights to use the Atari name. And the book kind of passes this over, but Namco had originally owned Atari Games after Atari fell apart and split. You had basically Jack Tramiel from Commodore, he bought the computer side, and Namco bought the video game side, essentially. And it's kind of weird the way you get into that, but you know, it's a pretty interesting story. Anyway, Tengen, which I'm going to refer to them now because I don't really want to keep calling them Atari. Tengen thought they had the home rights to Tetris, and they start programming their game. As an aside, the Tengen version of Tetris for the NES is way better than the Nintendo version. But at least that's my opinion. It's a lot of other people's opinions as well. But anyway, Hank Rogers steps back into this, and he goes, I want to get basically all the rights for home console, arcade, and computers for Japan. He's unable to get the arcade, but I think he's able to get both computer and home console rights. And he starts publishing the Famicom version of Tetris. Now, at some point in this, he also finds out about the Game Boy. He's in Nintendo of America, and they show him a prototype for the Game Boy, and he convinces them, you should put Tetris on this. That way it kind of appeals to everybody. Basically, the backstory for this, Rogers had a really good working relationship with Nintendo at this point. He basically programmed the game Go for Nintendo. I don't know how many other games he did do. Bulletproof Software did do another game called Hatris, which is weird. But they also got the rights for. Basically, they also released Tetris in Japan. I don't think they did Tetris in the US. I think that was just a Nintendo product. But they also had Tetris on the handheld. Now, handheld games really weren't a huge thing at this point, but once Rogers saw that and convinced Nintendo, hey, we should get the handheld rights to this. Rogers then reaches out to Stein to try to get the handheld rights. And he offers him like $25,000, which back in the 80s is pretty nice chunk of money up front. Stein kind of blows him off, thinking, well, I don't have the handheld rights yet, but I can get them. He also didn't have the arcade rights either, so he was trying to get both the arcade and the handheld rights. He had just finalized his deal for the computer rights and what he thought was the home console rights. So he blows them off, and he also... So Stein screws himself, like, really bad, because he blows off Rogers, and then he also tips off Mirrorsoft that somebody's looking for the handheld rights. I think from what I remember, it was like, do you want them, or would you be interested in them, or something along those lines. And this is kind of where we go back to like the first chapter, because Stein, Rogers, and Kevin Maxwell. Again, I'm getting all the names messed up here. It would help if I actually referred to my notes, but I'm lazy. So Maxwell, Stein, and Rogers all end up going to Moscow to get Rogers is trying to get the handheld rights. Stein is still trying to get all of the rights because Stein really screwed himself, to be honest with you. And Maxwell is going to get the handheld rights. Now Maxwell ends up messing everything up for both Stein and for himself because he doesn't know anything about really the video game industry, and he doesn't know anything about the rights outside of what his company purchased, and he vaguely knows that they've sub-licensed stuff out. And yeah, one more thing. Maxwell's dad also has like really close ties to Moscow. He's a media mogul. He used to own the Mirror Group, which was like newspapers, publishing, and also video games as well. So anyway, these three people all go there. Rogers ends up meeting with Elorg first. He's not invited, but he just kind of like shows up, and the person that ran Elorg, Nikolai Belikov, he decides, you know what, screw it, we'll let a third person in. It might not be like totally kosher with the state that I'm meeting with a foreigner, but whatever, I'll let this guy in. And through his conversations with Rogers, he finds out like how bad Elorg and how bad the Soviet Union is getting screwed by Stein. So Stein was late with the payments for royalties, and also, at least from like the discussions in the book, he's not paying them very much. So the Soviet Union's not getting paid on time, and they're also not getting paid what they think they should be getting paid, because they're getting reports back of like millions of copies of this game getting sold, and they're just getting like a trickle of money coming in. So basically, Rogers finds all this out from his interaction with Belikov, and pays back, like basically pays them the unpaid royalties for the Japanese home console one in the tune of, I think like 40 grand. And that really excites Belikov. He's like, oh my god, we got like a whole bunch of money. We can probably get more from this guy, because he says he's representing this Japanese company, which I had never heard of, or at least he had never heard of. And so that kind of gets the wheels turning, like maybe there's more money that we can end up getting. So he ends up giving the handheld rights to Rogers after like this really convoluted negotiations with Maxwell and Stein. He makes Stein sign an agreement, like an amendment to their agreement, which adds like a more strict definition of a home computer, and that basically strips the home console rights away from Stein. Because that took the home console rights away from Stein, those are now back in play. So the handheld rights are gone. The home computer rights and the arcade rights, those are all gone. So we just have the home console rights now. And Nintendo, like through like very cloak and dagger way, they end up getting the home console rights, which would in turn screw over Tengen, because Tengen was already making cartridges and like planning to sell them, and actually did have like a launch and start selling their own version of Tetris. And then like a bunch of court cases that were going on at the time where Nintendo is getting sued by... They're getting sued by Atari Games. They're getting sued by a few other people as well, mostly for being a monopoly and for very monopolistic practices. And they end up winning the lawsuit against Tengen for the rights to Tetris, mostly because of the amendment that Stein had signed, which stripped those rights away from Tengen. And Nintendo ends up putting out their own home console version of Tetris. And they also have like the handheld version. The handheld version, I'm pretty sure, was way more successful than the home console version, at least in the U.S. Mostly because, at least from the math that was in here, of like 1/3 of all the Game Boys that were sold were the Game Boys that were sold that had Tetris in with it. So it's a pretty good payday for Rogers, pretty good payday for most of the people involved, to be honest with you. That kind of closes everything up. There's a few more things in there as well that I kind of glossed over. I didn't think they were that important, and I probably could not have explained them very well. I probably didn't explain this very well either. But for the most part, everybody involved, things worked out pretty well for them. Pajitnov eventually gets the rights to Tetris back, so he eventually gets royalties. It took him like 10 years or so to actually start seeing money from the game that he made. And it's still a lot of fun. Tetris really it's a really fun game. They are still making versions of it. I think the latest one was Tetris Effect on PS4, but don't quote me on. Don't quote me on that. but it's still being made today. Paganoff's still getting money for it, which is really really great for him. I mean, it's kind of sucked that he lost the ability to make money off it just because of the way that it was made and the way that and like where he was when he made the game. But whatever, it all worked out for him. So what I really like about this book is the way they lay out the story. It makes a lot of sense. It can be a little confusing, but for the most part, you can pretty much follow it. It's a really great, really crazy story. Some things that I don't like about the book. Dan includes 3 chapters at the end of each section that are basically like scientific studies, like how Tetris was used in scientific studies, and sort of like how the phrase "the Tetris effect" was really like made more popular and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of nice information in there, but I hate them. Like, I really hate those 3 chapters. At least in my opinion, they don't need to be there. Like, they're not important. What's important is the actual story that was being told about Tetris. But that's just my book. That's just my opinion. Definitely not my book. I wish this was my book. It would be much better written than anything I've written. But this is a really great story. Aside from those 3 chapters, this is a really awesome book. I really do recommend it. It's like, I had a lot of fun reading it. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling now. So, if you guys, thank you for watching. If you guys like the video, please let me know in the comments below. If you hate the video, definitely let me know as well. Or if you just think, Paul, you need to actually pay attention to the script that you wrote and actually read the notes that you've written, that would really be great as well. I'll try to do that for the next one. So we're gonna move back to a different book next time. It's gonna be more of the like the social commentary, social science, that sort of thing, which is probably gonna bore the hell out of a lot of you. But I find that kind of interesting when you're talking about video games. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. Have a great day, everyone.